may begin.
Good afternoon, everyone. As we continue our African American History Centennial Speaker Series, we are reminded that Black excellence has never been isolated. It has always been about community and collaboration. 100 years ago, our ancestors fought for the right to basic literacy, and they fought so that our students could have books. But as we look toward 2026, the battlefield of liberation has moved into the digital realm. Today, we fight for our students to have the code, the algorithms, and the inventions. This conversation is a vital part of our centennial because we know that if we do not design the future, we will be forced to live in a future designed without us. To help us architect that future, we have invited a brilliant mind from our sister school right here in the University System of Maryland. Coming to us from Salisbury University, our guest today is a bridge builder between tradition and technology. Our speaker is Dr. Diallo D. Sessoms, an award-winning innovator and passionate advocate for student success through technology and transformative education. Dr. Sessoms is a tenured professor at Salisbury University, where his pioneering work integrates cutting edge instructional technology and maker centered learning into teacher preparation. In 2020, the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education honored him for excellence in classroom technology integration. And in 2022, he led the launch of an educational makerspace that supports hand on learning and invention. He holds a PhD in instructional technology from the University of Virginia and is the author of a foundational textbook on technology in education. He is currently writing a new book on invention literacy and designing companion work coursework that empowers learners to invent to learn. Today's presentation, Preserving the Past, Designing the Future, explores the rich legacy of innovation in the Black community and how we can honor the legacy while preparing the next generation of educators for a digital inventive future. Through his work, Dr. Sessom challenges to embrace the innate spirit of ingenuity that has always driven excellence and progress. So please join me in welcoming our colleague and brother in education, Dr. Diallo Sessoms.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And I want to thank Dr. Savoy and the committee for inviting me to participate in this commemoration. I also want to thank my wife for always supporting and encouraging me. I want to get us started by grounding us in a concept from the Akan people from Ghana, and that is Sankofa. And you may have heard of this term or this concept before. And what it represents is a mythic bird facing forward, and its head is reaching back. And it symbolizes the crux of what I'll be talking about today. And it literally stands for, it is not wrong to go back for that which you have forgotten. And in some ways, that's what February represents in Black history, some things that we've forgotten or may have never learned. Now, the image you're looking at right now is sort of an artistic rendition of the traditional, what they call an Adinkra symbol. And this is a picture that I took. It's a mural that I took when I was in Ghana. So I took a picture of that. So this is slightly different. If you've ever seen the Adinkra symbol for Sankofa, it's a little bit different from what this artist has done, but it nonetheless means the same thing. And that's what led me to this title in terms of preserving the past. So looking back at past innovators, thinking about their inventions, thinking about what they laid, the foundation they laid for us, and then bringing that to the future. So our feet facing forward and us learning and thinking about the tools we have today versus what they had before. Now, what they had before and what they did with that was incredible. And what we have now, we can do and build on that. And so that's designing the future and moving us forward. So Dr. Savoy gave you a very nice introduction, and I just wanted to add a few more details to that. I'll start out by letting you know that I was a public school teacher. I taught middle school, and normally when I tell people that, they look at me with a little sigh, because middle school teachers, we're known to be in a tough situation because that's a transition period for students. But nonetheless, I really loved it. And I taught for about 10 years at the high school level, middle school level. I taught geometry, algebra, trigonometry, so mostly focused on math. And as a teacher, I mentioned before that my wife is always encouraging me. So she suggested that I pursue something a little bit further because she always saw that I always wanted to do a little bit more. So that's when I started my program at the University of Virginia. And my degree is in instructional technology. One of the foundations of our program was about teachers and students being producers. So this idea was sort of born there in terms of thinking about teachers and students being producers, because in the classroom and in our daily lives too, we consume a lot of information. We consume a lot of things. And that's okay because we do need to consume the information. We do need to get the information. But then when we consume too much and we don't produce, when we don't use our ingenuity, that muscle can deteriorate. So I focus on teachers and students being producers. And as Dr. Savoy said, I got this Innovator Award for thinking about how we can integrate maker education into teacher education so that the classroom becomes a maker space so that students and teachers both, not just students and not just teachers, but students and teachers both become producers of content, producers of knowledge. And you, like I said, you always need that consumption part. You always need that part where you impart information and students need to receive it. But then what do you do with that information? What do you create and what do you learn with? And that's where my focus is. And the book that I have, the book that I wrote already is a course text that I use for my classes. And the upcoming book, I'm excited about writing it. And it focuses on a lot of things that I'll be talking about today. So to sort of ground this in multicultural education, I looked at Dr. Banks's four levels of multicultural education, and I wanted to interpolate innovation onto that because I wanted to have that sort of social piece to it. So that technology is more than just this thing we play with or this thing that we play games on or we go on social media or it's just this thing over there. So in Banks's model, he has four levels, and that's in the first column: contributions, additive, transformative, and social action. And then we'll look at the core focus. And then the next two columns, they're associated with the title of this talk: preserving the past, designing the future, and then some connections. So at that first level, contributions, you can think about what usually happens during this month, right now, where we focus on holidays and we focus on figures and we highlight some of the things that they've done in the past. And that stuff is important. And at first, Dr. Banks thought that this was not a good idea, but then he later thought that this was you need to start somewhere. And so highlighting people, highlighting figures is a good thing. But then, so for designing the future, we move it a little further. And we might have students create living museums where they look up these individuals that we highlight and then they create something with it. And this idea came from, there's a museum in Philadelphia where you can actually do that. You go in there and they have images of different figures and you push a button and it talks to you. But students can actually do that in the classroom too with tools like, this is called the Makey. And you'll see what that looks like as we go through. But at this level, it's the connection here is that the innovation is seen as a special event rather than something continuous and a cultural process. Then we get to the additive, where a teacher might go to, they might have an idea or they might go to a conference and they'll integrate it immediately into their lesson, and they might integrate it into a geometry lesson or a physics lesson. And then, so that's preserving the past. They're talking about the Black architect, talking about the engineers, talking about the contributions they made. And so that's bringing up the past. But then to design the future at this level, you might think about students creating 3D models of those structures. And here you start to preserve the past by ensuring diverse names are woven into existing STEM requirements. Because if we don't do something specific and intentional, it won't just happen. Students won't just get this information and teachers won't just get this information. So it does have to be very intentional. And you could think of the first two levels as sort of enhancements in this process. And when we get to the last two, that's where the transformation really starts to happen. So for transformative, now we start to see structural change to curriculum to view concepts from diverse perspectives. So we might look at invention for preserving the past. We might look at invention as a tool for liberation and community problem solving. So we think about an example, George Washington Carver. He had lots of inventions, and I'm sure many of you've heard his name before. But one of his things was combating soil depletion, and that's why he created one of his inventions is to combat that. One of his ideas, because when you overplant soil, it will deplete the vegetation and take out the nutrients. And so we could think about design in the future. How do we get students to think about this? And there's something called a microbit, and it has sensors in it, and they can do projects like in community gardens. They can build solutions for testing the moisture or other things that it has a heat sensor as well. So there's things that students can gather around to do. And in the connection here, the students start to see themselves as part of a long lineage of problem solvers rather than just consumers. So they started at that contribution level, thinking about who they were, and you'll learn these things, and then you'll walk out the classroom and maybe not think about it until the following year. But at this transformative level, they start to think of themselves and see themselves as thinking like that, but also having the tools that they can actually use to do some of the things that people have done in the past. And then we get to social action. And if this were, I guess you could think of this as a hierarchy, and this is the ultimate part that we would want to get to, is where the decision making gets to taking action to solve a particular problem. So you might analyze how systemic inequities like redlining or patent hurdles hindered past invaders. So that's preserving the past. And thinking about that, somebody like Garrett Morgan, even though he created the gas mask, and it was a very important invention because it's something that was used to save lives, from firefighting to using it in World War One. He couldn't sell that thing though. He couldn't sell that to certain communities. He had to have a white face on it. And if you've ever heard of that in the music industry, same thing. Some of the bands at that time, at a certain time, had to, on their cover, put a different face so that they could sell it. So understanding those types of things. And then design in the future, students might identify a local systemic issue. And that's an important piece to understand, is that it's local and it's personal. It's something that you can put your teeth into. So it might start in the classroom. It might expand to the school. It might expand to the community in terms of the issue that they're looking at. They might invent something to address. And sometimes so inventing something is not an easy process. So I don't want to make it sound too easy, but it's doable and achievable. But sometimes the idea needs to be there. And you'll see an example later how the idea might come early, but later on the actual solution comes. So you plant that seed, and then later on, when you get different skills, you'll be able to achieve that goal. And so students might use invention literacy to actively design and create to take social action. Marie Brown is known for the CCTV. And if you have a Ring doorbell or a Nest system or anything like that, those are inventions that are touching the past. And that's what a lot of these inventions that you'll see today, or a lot of the people that you know about, things they did then are still with us today. So she did this because, going back to that personal reason, going back to that community and thinking about a social action to take, she created this because there was a slow police response to calls. She's from Queens, and the area she lived, it was a little rough. So she decided, well, I'm going to invent something to help myself. But ultimately, it started to help others. And that's something else that grows out of invention, is that it may start out as something simple and small to solve a single problem, but then it multiplies and it solves other people's problems. So let's take a look at a legacy of engineering. We're going to look at some different inventors, and I'm going to give you some insights about why I chose them and why we might look at them. And this list is by no means exhaustive, because there's so many people that have contributions, from very small contributions to major contributions. So these are just some that I selected for specific reasons. Now, Benjamin Banneker, that's probably a name that everybody hears around this time of the year, or that might be a name that floats up pretty frequently. So I chose him. If you look under this first description of him, self-taught. So a lot of these inventors do that. They teach themselves certain things, and which is something that I think is missing in students. Not that it's a negative thing that is not there, but they don't have that idea of, I don't have to get all of my learning in the four walls at school. And you'll see some examples of what I mean by that as I go through the presentation. But that's one reason why I chose him. The other reason why I chose him is because his invention of the clock. And the clock is something that I could actually use in a classroom where students can create projects around. They can recreate it. They can create different versions of it. So his invention is something that we can use as an example in the classroom that students can actually touch the history and think like Mr. Banneker thought. Now, these are just a few other innovators. Now, the first two, I want to highlight that they didn't invent something that was physical or tangible. There's no patent to it. But Dr. Savoy mentioned something very important in her introduction when she talked about modern times and how we need to be able to design and understand the technology. So the algorithm, if you've heard that term before, and we're starting to introduce that word into students, into the classroom, but that word algorithm, that can become a very valuable commodity. That thing can actually have a patent to it. And so Google has an algorithm that they won't show you because it's proprietary. And all of the big companies have algorithms like that. Facebook, any of them have that. So it's important for kids to understand too that invention doesn't necessarily have to be a physical, tangible object, although that's what you normally see with inventions is that it's a thing. And so these innovators are important because they develop systems or businesses that supported the community. And George Washington Murray, one of the reasons why I selected him is because he was a politician, a teacher, and a farmer. And his inventions, he had over 100 patents, but he's an example of having the invention as well as being a leader in the community. And sometimes those things don't, not that it's a bad thing, but sometimes everybody doesn't do that. They'll invent something, but they may not have that leadership quality. And so he actually was in Congress. He ran for office and did things like that along with being an inventor. Next, we get to Garrett Morgan. Again, this is another one that another name that probably crops up. Now, something I didn't know before is that he actually invented this gas mask and that he tested it. He called it a safety hood, and he tested it by, there was a real fire, Lake Erie fire, and he had to go in the building to use this thing because before this, he couldn't really nobody would listen to him until he actually used it and it saved lives. And then it became the precursor to the gas mask for World War I, and he has a patent for that as well as the traffic light. The traffic light is probably the thing that's most commonly known. And if you look to the left of that traffic light, you'll see a little drawing here, and that's from an elementary student. So I spent a lot of time in elementary schools, and they were studying different figures, and it just so happened they were studying Garrett Morgan. So this worksheet has Garrett Morgan's name at the top of it, and they've colored this stoplight, but they stopped there. So this invention side of things, students can actually learn how to make a traffic light work and understand what Garrett Morgan was thinking about when he created it and why he created it. And this is another example of social action that somebody takes because this actually saved lives. It reduced the number of carriage and automobile accidents. And so students thinking about, I can impact my world with technology. It doesn't, technology does have this dark side to it, and AI isn't helping with that. Social media doesn't help with that. So there are some things that we do need to address, but it also has this prolific side to it that can be very beneficial to the community. And he's another one that was a community leader. So he had this newspaper where he could get information out to people, which is critical for students to know. So something that you'll notice about inventors, they're multifaceted. They have more than one thing that they do, which I really want to make sure teachers understand and make sure students get that message about our history, because we didn't stay in just one lane. We had our hands in lots of different things. Marie Van Britten Brown is, now the reason why I wanted to select her is because what she invented is with us today. And so it shows that span of, it connects to that sort of reaching back and moving forward. Companies have used her knowledge and used what she created, and they're moving forward, but kids need to understand that they could do the same thing. And again, like I said, she did this out of social action, that's why I have this image here. She was thinking about safety. She was using technology to address a safety concern. Same thing with Alice Parker. I was not familiar with her before, but her invention sort of lives with us today because buildings are heated. And at this time of the year, we're glad we have central heating because it definitely makes a difference. So her invention and students knowing that they can impact the world, and impact can last for centuries or decades to centuries. That's an important thing for them to understand from an invention standpoint. Then we have data and systems. And Dr. Charles Drew is another name that's probably well known around Black History Month, or one of the names that pops up when you talk about Black history. And then I wanted to focus on Dr. West because her work around GPS, again, connects to today, things that kids carry in their pockets, college students, even elementary kids have them now, and that's the modern smartphone. And so her work around that, if you're joining this presentation on a phone, if you're if you're using any kind of mobile device, it likely has a GPS component to it. Next, we'll take a look at microphones and networks. So the microphone, now James E. West is not widely known in terms of Black History Month, but he was a Bell Lab scientist, and he created something called the electret microphone. And that's not a misspelling, that's exactly what it's called. And it's in 90% of the devices that have, if it has a speaker or a microphone in it, it has his touch on it, because that's what his work was around. And it's impacting us at this moment. So the speakers and things that we use are from his invention. And then we have things like digital infrastructure. So again, going back to not necessarily a physical thing, although you could consider a wireless company a thing, but he created these communication systems, these architectures that shape the wireless industry. And that allows us to do what we're doing right now. So without that wireless network that we have in this country and around the world, we couldn't get together unless we flew in and we were face to face. But this work around the communication systems allows us to communicate without boundaries, which is a critical aspect of everything that we do in our work now. So now I want to move to some inventive, whimsical fun. And I wanted to focus here because students also, being young, they want to have fun too. So those are some serious inventions that we just talked about. And they were, in some cases, life-changing inventions. But there's also inventions that can be whimsical and that can be things that are just for fun. Not that that detracts from what they are and what they can be, but it gives you a different entree into talking to kids, because they, when you're teaching, they want to have fun while they're learning. So the first one I want to take a look at is Dr. Tahiri Reed Smith. And I chose her because, and this goes back to what I mentioned about an example of planting that seed early. So this top picture is something that she did in the 3rd grade. And there was a poster contest where they were thinking about inventions or things they would like to change. And so she loved double dutch. And double dutch, of course, requires 3 people, 2 people to hold the ropes and 1 person to jump. But her question was, well, what do I do if I do not have those people with me to be able to do that? And so she drew a picture of what she would like to happen. And this was in the 3rd grade. Fast forward to her college years, she came back to that. So she embodied that sort of Sankofa concept that I talked about earlier. She reached back to her earlier self and brought this idea forward. And then working with professors at her university, she actually developed a double dutch machine. And it's an incredible example of how or why we need to talk to students about invention, talk to students about their ideas, let them express their ideas, no matter how silly or small or grand they may be. They can turn it into something later, possibly. Now I'm not saying this is easy, but this is just an example of what can be done if we encourage kids to think inventively, to think about innovation, to use modern tools, to learn them, to understand them, to learn that language, because technology is its own language. And we're learning, like with AI, it's becoming, one of the benefits of AI is that it's changing programming from having to know a special code to more of a natural language. So when you type when you type a prompt into the AI, that's actually you coding. And so that's why they talk about prompt engineers, and the better your prompt is, the more precise it is, the more detailed it is, the better the result. And that's exactly what we try to teach kids about the work they do. So if they're writing a paper, the more organized, the better it is, the more detailed, the better it is. And so this idea of programming now becomes something sort of like natural language, where you're just using English to type, to tell the thing, to create the thing that you want to happen. And that's an incredible advancement to happen. And again, there is, like I said, there is a dark side. There are things to worry about, but there are also some things that are very beneficial. But going back to Dr. Smith and her doing this in the third grade. So a third grader now might be able to do something like this in a makerspace. They could make something like this or something that resembles it. It may not work exactly the way it should because they're younger and they may not have all the tools they need, but they could actually simulate something like this in a makerspace. So the next one I'll go to, this is, I call this serendipitous soak because the super soaker was discovered by accident. So Lonnie Johnson was an aerospace engineer and he worked for NASA. So he had a very serious career and he just happened to be doing something else and discovered that, well, if I apply this physics principle, I can create this wonderful toy. And on the face of it, maybe, a water gun, what good does that do society? But one thing that it can do, one thing that it can do is create jobs. So that his company around this, it creates jobs. So your invention in that case is solving a problem with a social problem with giving people to work and also to develop their inventiveness. So the power of air pressure actually created a toy. So physics in the hands of kids, and there's no batteries with this. And that's the other thing, it's about energy conservation. So these two tools are just these two examples are just to highlight the idea of kids might have whimsical ideas when you talk about invention in the classroom. And that's okay, because if they're inventing, if they're thinking this way, just like Lonnie Johnson did, he was on one path and veered off to this other thing that it's related to what he was doing because this high pressure stream that he noticed from this heat pump he was trying to fix at his house, he was able to then take that idea and put it somewhere else. And students can do the same thing. As long as when you're thoroughly immersed in something, you can take your ideas and your ideas might take you in places that you can't imagine. So how do we move students from memorizing who invented the traffic light to students believing they can invent? And there's different ways to approach this. So this is just the way I think about things. Now, earlier I mentioned about receiving that award for innovation, and this is part of what did that. And this is a classroom on the campus of Salisbury University. And it actually was two classrooms side by side. This was traditionally a computer lab, and it was just rows of computers and a podium in front. And that kind of space is not useful for what making is, because if you see this, we've got some space, we've got tables. Now along the walls back here, there's materials, and in these cabinets, there's materials and things like that. And through here, there's more sort of resources. But if it's just a traditional computer lab, we couldn't do work like this. So I had to get permission to take all the computers out. So I gutted that lab and took all the computers out, and then we set up this space as a place for students to learn how to create and invent. And beside it, though, it's still a computer lab, because some things that we create don't require any sort of technology or electronics. Other things that we create, it's a marriage between the software and the hardware. And so we call that physical computing. And that's when you create something that has user input. The student were to create something that, like I mentioned earlier, about a living museum, and I go to that person that they selected and I touch something on that thing they built, it'll say something. So they have to program a tool to be able to make that happen. So we have the lab right beside us, and we have the makerspace on this side. And the way this flow works is we sometimes start in a computer lab and go to the makerspace, and sometimes we start at a makerspace and go to the computer lab. It just depends on what we're doing. For example, when I had students work with the microbit, one thing that they had to do was to program it to say something based on a children's text that they read. So in the makerspace, they designed their character first, and they figured out they read the book, they designed the character, then they designed and thought about, well, where will I put this microbit? And once they figured that part out, we went to the other side, and now we get on the computer to program the microbit and then we bring those two things together. And that's what makes invention happen in an educational context. And it doesn't have to be through literature. I just choose to do it through literature because because they have to teach kids reading and working with different types of text. So that's a perfect entree into helping teachers think about this. One of the books I used is Yvonne Spark, but they could very well be books about, if someone wrote a book about Gary Morgan, let's say, a children's book, you can select the books that actually work best. So another concept is, or another way to get kids to think about this is to make the unknown known. And this comes from a conversation that my wife and I have a lot on thinking about growing up on the Eastern Shore of Virginia, because we both grew up there. And Purdue has their main factory is in Accomack County. So growing up, we know Purdue is a factory. People dressed in black boots and white coats, and they go and slaughter chickens and come home and they work. That's all we really knew about it growing up. But then coming to Salisbury, we find out there's this innovation hub. There's a place where people go get a 4-year degree and they learn how to invent different ways to flavor chicken or to process chicken. Similar to what George Washington Carver was doing with the peanut, and find many different ways to use it. We didn't know that existed. So that concept of making the unknown known is important. So you see me holding in one hand what's called a makey, in one hand a microbit, because I'm showing students what it is. Now, normally these things are inside of items, so they're in a device. So in your phone, if you were to crack your phone open, I don't suggest you doing that unless you don't mind buying a new one. So if you open this, you'll see boards like this, but you never get to see them if you don't open things like that, or if you don't show them things like this. And this is one of the things I was talking about earlier, where today we have access to knowledge and resources that years ago you wouldn't be able to access. And we can put this in front of students. So you can explain why this tiny device allows students to code interactions, and they both allow you to do that. And so what you would do in a classroom in terms of invention with this is you would have students remix inventions. So you would think about like the super soaker, you think about the traffic light, you think about things that were invented that could actually be used for students to remix and remake or build on, or use as a platform to say, all right, this inventor created this thing, I'm going to build on that. And that's kind of how knowledge works anyways, that we build on the shoulders of giants. And then number two, they could create new inventions. So thinking about Dr. Smith's double Dutch machine, who knew that a third grader could think of something like that? But that's a passion that she had. And so it made it a lot easier for her to be able to focus on that. And that's one thing that these inventors had, was a lot of passion. So making the unknown known, introducing students to things that they might not ever be introduced to, because a lot of times something like this, there are invention leagues, there's robotics clubs, there's coding clubs, but one thing that all of those ideas have in common is that they happen in gifted and talented, probably, or after school, or some special place, but not in the main place, where students go. And we want the classroom to be more, in terms of technology and invention, to be more like the media center at an elementary school. So if you're familiar with an elementary school, the media center, there's only one, and every class runs through that. And that's what we want students to be able to do. We want classrooms to be maker spaces, and every kid gets to come through that. Not that it needs to be every student is an inventor, or every student does this thing or that thing, but that they're exposed to it, that they know the unknown. So now I want to talk about this connection now, advancing Black history from passive memorization to invention discovery. And that's exactly what we have with understanding what Banneker did, what Parker did, what Russell did. So looking at them and sort of memorizing those facts, understanding who they are and what they did. But then our work as educators is putting tools in the hands of our students so they can write the next century of history, so they can make the next inventions, so they can make the next double Dutch machine, or whatever thing that they think is important to them and could solve some problem for society. And then design the future. So we can talk about students actively emulating, building the technology for the ancestors pioneered. We can encourage students to invent. So I mentioned earlier about small ideas and grand ideas. And it doesn't matter how small it is, because we want students to think about invention. We want them to, we don't want to discourage anything, because you never know what small spark, what small piece of yarn you pull will lead them to that grand idea. And so here are a couple of examples of connecting to ancestors and the things that they've created. So on the left, you see this clock. Now, it's not the exact clock that Benjamin Banneker created, but the idea of a clock, empowering that clock and making it do something and programming, that is exactly what we want to do with invention. And so this, they actually call this an invention kit. And a lot of these things will use that term, invention kit. And you can program this too. And all this is made of is some construction paper, maybe cardboard, and then brass fasteners. So those materials are probably just at hand. And then a device like this is fairly inexpensive, so it's much cheaper than buying a computer. It's about $50, $40, depending on when you buy it. But it gives students access and entree far more than a computer could, because the computer, we can punch a lot of keys and we can get on the web and we can do lots of things, but you can't sort of control it in a way that you can control this, because the computer is, it's a fixed thing. Your phone is a fixed thing, and it has an operating system that does its own thing. And over here with these inventions, we can tell it to do what we want it to do. And you can't really do that with devices that are sort of closed. And if you look to the right, so this is a wristwatch that's made with the microbit. And this could be something that a student could take advantage of and design something for themselves. For example, they might design a watch that'll remind them to wake up when they fall asleep in class, or to remind them to do their homework, or to tell them to take their medicine, because this little display, this has 25 LED lights, and it can send it, you can program it to send a message, but it also has an accelerometer. And so it means it'll detect movement, so it can count steps, for example. But these tools like this, they're based on Roy Clay Sr. and his work, because he was a pioneer with HP, and his work, he worked in, his work led to the first micro or mini computer. And that's what these are kind of like computers. They don't operate independently, so they're not quite computers, but they're in that vein of being small computers. They could be put into things, and they could put into inventions that students have. And so this image just shows us the connection that we can make, especially in the middle. So if I haven't mentioned this before, this is called a Raspberry Pi. And if you are, or if you know people that are DIY people, do-it-yourself people, you can actually create things like this. Now that's a little more advanced, and that's more for middle school, high school, but it's still something that you can introduce, and you can actually create systems because it has little cameras. So you notice here, the CCTV, those were, those cameras then were nothing like what we have now. So cameras now can be the size of a button or a pen, and students can actually work with them in class, and they can build things based on what they've learned from the past. But that's one of the things that's missing, is that we have all these resources, we have all these capabilities, we have all this potential, but we don't know what we don't know. We don't know what we can do with it. And if we study inventors, if we study their innovation, we can see that if I focus on something, then I can take these resources that I have and I can move forward. I can build things, I can move things. This leads to another question. How do we teach this level of complex innovation in public schools? So one way is we can't just lecture, because if we just lecture, that will we'll get what we've been getting. And if we just talk to students, that won't work. If we just give them work that's not that doesn't access their ingenuity, that doesn't access their creativity, they won't grow. That muscle will disappear like muscles do when you don't use them. So we need to let them build. Now, as they build, this leads to my call to action. And I've been talking about a lot of this throughout this presentation. And the first one is to educate. So we need to give teachers incentive to integrate invention literacy, give them the historical knowledge because they don't have knowledge of this type of history that I'm talking about. These, Black inventors and Black innovators. That's not part of what they don't get this stuff in school. We don't get it in school either. These are things that we have to go out and learn on our own. So educating the educators so that they can be prepared with students. Equip the classrooms. So the microbit and these circuit boards are fairly cheap. The 3D printer, that's a little more expensive, but they started out being $10,000, then they were $5,000. Then there's some that are $900, and the cheapest one that you can buy now is about $200. So you can actually, it's actually affordable, but it's probably going to get cheaper as well. So equipping classrooms with these things. Now, if you go to many schools, they'll probably be in a library and they're not being used much. And that's because this part isn't happening enough because the educators don't understand what to do with them enough to take advantage of them. They're good to go, drop it off to the teacher that takes care of the technology, but then coming back to the classroom, that's not my thing. And so that's what we want to change with teachers is, well, my classroom is the thing. My classroom is the makerspace. I'll still go out and get that support, but I know what I can do and I want to do it. We want to encourage, we want to fuel the inventor in students because all of us have that inventive nature. All of us have that creativity and ingenuity built into us. So we can inspire the next Dr. Gladys West to find her genius in the 5th grade, or in the case of Dr. Smith in the 3rd grade, and not have to wait till grad school. And that's the potential of what innovation and invention allows for us, is that we can get that early. And as I mentioned before, when I go to conferences, technology conferences for educators, there's a special section for kid inventors. And we want to change that from being a special section to it being the thing that kids do, being inventive. We want to let them solve problems and build to solve those problems. And it doesn't matter if the first time they build something that doesn't work, they can keep building, and that's the iteration process. Now, I choose to go through literature as well, because I think that's a good way to access information and for students to access information and for students to see potential. So in this book, she builds bridges, she takes or a tower, she takes apart a toaster. And in my class, I have students use something called straw beads, and these are just straws with little connectors. And so they build the tower that she built. But then from there, I might challenge them to what else would you build? And how could we test the strength of shapes? Like, which shape is more powerful for a bridge, a triangle or a square or a circle? And these are real problems. These are real math problems that some math classrooms use. But giving that hands-on piece to it and that building piece to it, that inventive piece to it, is something different. It's another level to it. And then we need to give them the opportunity. We want to expose them to inventors and invention during childhood to increase the likelihood that they'll become an inventor, an innovator and inventor. Again, we don't need everybody to do it, and it doesn't mean that we have to have everybody do it, but it is important that everybody knows that they can do it and that the possibility is there, and that even if they don't become sort of world famous inventors, they can be an inventor on a small level. They can solve problems in their house. They can solve problems in their community. They can solve problems, on a smaller scale. It doesn't have to be a giant scale. So that's the important thing that we need to do. And in my closing reflection, I want you to take a moment and I just want you to read this passage, and then I have a few words for you. So this is from William Kamkwamba. He actually wrote this in his book when he was talking about himself. If you're familiar with his stories from Malawi, this is a movie on Netflix, and you can watch the movie. And then there's a children's book as well. But he didn't invent this. He didn't invent the windmill, but he had an inventive nature, and he used the windmill to solve a problem that he had. And the problem that he had as a young boy, he talks about it in his book. And if you ever visit Africa, at a certain point, certain places, you lose power and it's dark for the rest of the night. So power was on for 12, off for 12. And he was frustrated at that as a child, as a young boy, as an energetic young boy. So he started reading books. Now, part of his story also is that he had to stop going to school because he couldn't pay the fees. But he had a librarian that would allow him to check out books. So he started reading science books and learning about circuits, learning about electricity. And he went to like a local scrapyard, found pieces, found whatever he could find, like bicycle wheels, things like that. And he built a windmill that first powered his room. So now he could stay up a little bit longer. Then he did it for his house. So he's expanding and branching out. Then he started doing it in his community. He eventually came here, and I think he went to a school in Pennsylvania. But that's his story, and that's the kind of story that I want for kids, and I want for teachers to understand is to know that kids have that inventive nature in them. We just need to spark that invention in them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sessoms. That was so informative. If you have any questions for Dr. Sessoms, please type them in the chat. We'll definitely address them. I do have a question for you. You mentioned the prompting of AI is a form of coding. How should we rethink literacy if programming is becoming more conversational?
Well, they're talking about AI as its own literacy for students. And so what teachers are going to have to start doing is focus on writing more. Because the better writer you are, because AI, if you read some articles, you'll see that English professors are the ones that get the most out of AI. And that's because they have a mastery of the language and a mastery of, developing sentences. And so in a way, the technology, we can get overrun with it. And you can see countries, they're ditching technology. And that's because we haven't been using it properly. But so teachers can learn to, teachers can focus on students being better writers and focus in on that writing and work with kids until they're excellent writers. And if you're an excellent writer, then you'll be able to take supreme advantage of AI because it's a natural language processor in that sense, because when you type that prompt in, it's literally translating your words into instructions to create whatever it is you're trying to create. And so it's critical that communication and writing and the literacy of that is, all of that is important for students and for teachers to know, to instill in kids now, because they're working with this AI, they're working with the AI, whether they're in class or not. And it's going to be important for teachers. Just like a lot of things, we always go to the classroom when there's something monumental that impacts society, like a tool like AI. The first place you run is to the classroom, because we know that if society is changing, we've got to prepare young kids for that change in society. So that focusing on writing and literacy and understanding how to powerfully communicate is one of the approaches that we need.
Okay. So you mentioned Dr. Reed Smith returned to a third grade idea years later. And so how do we create the educational environments where ideas are preserved rather than dismissed?
So one thing I would do is, I mentioned how some of the special things that happen at school are special class, after school, summertime, and all those things are fine. I don't want to take away from that. But if we make it more mainstream for the classroom so that students read books like this, and then like The Boy Who Conquers the Wind, and then we ask them to think about what's something in your community that you could address. And it doesn't matter if it's something that they could never even build in their time in the classroom. And that's not the important part. The important part is that they think about that and they actually attempt to do it, whether it's a drawing or a prototype of it, or they can actually physically build it, or they can design it and 3D print a model of it. Those are the kinds of things that we want to do to preserve and sort of have, like, once they do that, have a showcase of it so that students can remember that experience, because we remember things that we make. When I was in elementary school, we had, I don't know why we had this, but we had a kiln and we did pottery. I don't know where that came from, where the money came from, but I remember making, it wasn't great. I made like a little rock with my name in it. I made a little cup, but I remember those moments. And so when we give students chance chances to make and create, those are memorable because they wire our brains in a different way. They wire our brain in a different way than sort of reading things or just hearing things. Because when we physically do it, it's kind of like taking notes. You can handwrite notes rather than type them. It communicates to your brain differently, and then kids can remember that, and we can preserve it in that way by having them make things.
Thank you. As we close, I want to return to the heart of the message today, preserving the past and designing the future. We were reminded that innovation is not new to us. It is part of our lineage, from Banneker to Parker to Morgan to the digital system that empowers our world today. Our fingerprints are on the technologies that shape society. But honoring that history is not enough. Our responsibility as educators and as a university community is to place the tools of invention into the hands of our students so that they are not memorizing history, but writing the next century of it. So we must create these spaces where ideas are nurtured, where students see themselves as producers, and where innovation is not occasional, but continuous. Dr. Sessoms, thank you for reminding us that invention is both inheritance and responsibility. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Well said.
Thank you, everyone. This concludes the program.